Okay, so I was thinking about what's interesting, what's a little different. And so right now, I guess the stock market is less interesting to a lot of people because it's tracking sideways or down. And so people are potentially looking at other asset classes. People are a bit unsure about property, particularly in our area, with changes in interest rates. And, Isaac and I were talking recently about, fixed mortgages becoming variable soon. And so not knowing how the market's going to be impacted by that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different things that people invest in. And the tricky thing about it is a lot of these assets are high priced. The best thing about stocks is that they're generally speaking, unless it's like Berkshire Hathaway or something, the stock prices. And I mean, you can buy, incremental pieces of stock anyway. Like you don't have to buy a single unit. And so that's kind of the best thing about the stock market is really the entry point for anybody is really accessible. Crypto is similar in that regard, and so that's kind of cool. But then when you start talking about other things that wealthy people are often investing in, which is stuff like cars, watches, jewelry, etc., a lot of those things, the cost required up front is more than the average person can have. So, or so it has to offer. And so, one of those interesting asset classes, I think, is handbags.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say Rolex.
That's too easy. That's too easy. So this company that we're going to chat about today, we're going to chat about the big players in the luxury handbags / kind of fashion industry. And there really are only about 4 players, conglomerates in that industry that own basically everything.
Can I guess that you're going to talk about LVMH?
No.
Okay.
I'm not going to talk about that. That was also too easy.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about one. And I'll tell you, towards the end, I'll kind of like explain why it is this one that I think is most interesting. But the company is called Hermès, right? And so have you heard of it?
Is that how you pronounce it, Nathan?
You say it Hermès, or how it's a French company. So you've got to say it, Hermès, but I'm not going to say that.
But without the H.
Hermès. Oh, yeah. Okay. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. And so.
Wow. Hope we have a lot of French fans.
There's going to be a lot more of this in this next segment.
I'm looking forward to
it. I've spelt some of it out phonetically, but some of it I'm just going to have a crack. So basically,
no worries.
Hermès, that's probably the best way of saying it, is they do have 4 subsidiaries, but probably one of the main differences with them is that it's not necessarily a large conglomerate. Something like what you mentioned there, LVMH or whatever it is, and there's even a couple of other ones which I'll talk to you towards the end. They're very much just rolling up brands, merging companies together to kind of create these huge luxury fashion houses, owned oftentimes majority by founding families, which is pretty interesting. And so this particular company, it is majority privately owned. The class of shares that the family own allows them to have significantly more voting rights than the public shares, and it is publicly listed on the French exchange, or the exchange in Paris, and so you can buy it, and so that's why I wanted to talk about it. If it was public, it might have been totally useless. But so we'll talk about this company, and then talk about the handbags as we get towards the end. So the company have 4 subsidiaries. One of them is like a fashion fragrance brand called Jean Paul. Another one is John Lobb, which is a really easy one to say. And so they actually, they're basically a shoe brand, which is really interesting. They were founded by Hermès in 1976, and they do like belts, for example, for $500, shoes for $1,000 to $2,000, women's shoes about the same price as well. Another one which is interesting is they do silverware and cutlery, which is under a company called Puiforcat, and that was founded in 1820. And,
very confident on that one. That was good.
I just said it quick enough that you couldn't pick it up. And and it integrated in 1993 into the company. And finally, the last one is St. Louis. And so that's a crystal works company. It's really awesome. They make like such nice like tumblers and stoneware and stuff like that. And that's like $150 to $400 per piece. And that was founded in 1586, which is pretty crazy, but quite recently integrated, I think in 1996, into the Hermès brand. So other than that, they have their world a little bit in those other ancillary areas of fashion and lifestyle, but very much focused on their core business. And so their core business is is very much what they would call ready to wear and luxury goods.
This is really cool because it's one of those companies where they're building a legacy brand. So they're building something that's going to be like 1,000 years. They're not building something that's like 10 years and then really big and then nothing, So it's really long-term thinking.
It's exactly right. And so in the 90s, you'll notice that in the 90s that they rolled up the crystalware company and they took in the silverware company. So I think the concept there is that, as you said, it's a brand that people are starting to identify with or do identify with. They've always got handbags for their wife there. They've always bought your shoes there, whatever it is. And so now, Hermès has realized that. And so they're allowing people to kind of integrate it into the rest of their life, whether it be on the table, et cetera, fragrances, stuff like that. Hermès was started by Thierry Hermes. And he was born in Germany. And so he was born in 1801, which is a long time ago. It's pretty crazy. His mum was German and father was French. And it was in and around the time of like the Napoleonic War, which is like, in my head, just crazy. Because in my head, that's like another world. But yet we still have branded items that had the same brand in that era, if that makes sense. And I think that's
pretty crazy to think about.
That's really weird, in my head, that like some person knew this brand and I also know the brand. Obviously, their perception of it would have been different back then, as we'll talk about. But just that being a link between those generations is just really strange. Kind of actually talking about just such long lasting. So the family moved to Paris in 1828. So that is 27 years after he was born. And so basically he founded the company when he was 36. So some, 10 years or so, 9 years after that period of moving back to Paris. And the interesting thing is, at that point in time, all he was making was harnesses and bridles for like French noblemen. But from the very beginning, he was known for extreme quality over sort of price. So it doesn't really matter how much it's going to cost. This is how I'm going to do it. And this is the best possible way, best possible materials, sourcing the materials themselves, et cetera, et cetera.
So does that explain the logo? Because I'm pretty sure this is completely from memory, but is the logo a horse and carriage?
Yeah, it definitely is. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So that logo didn't exist back at this point because a horse and carriage was just so common that you wouldn't bother putting it on a logo, if that kind of makes sense. Sure. But later on, I'll mention that, one of the later owners of the company, or one of the later family members, I suppose, does create and trademark that logo. And that's what you've got in mind there. That's exactly right. And so, and chances are that they potentially still make a little bit of that stuff to this day, but I'm sure it's not very much of a contributor towards their revenue stream. So Thierry Hermes, as I said, founded in 1883 at the age of 36, which is kind of older. I guess that's interesting because, when you're 36, 36 is a good age. If anyone's 36, all power to you. But me, I'm, 25, 26, and I'm sort of thinking that's a real age. Like, this is an age where things, I don't know, things should be done by this age. But then,
I was thinking about that actually, as you said it. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing because it's this age where you should be a lot more confident in what you can do. But then if you're only just starting something, it's really funny. But in the next segment, I'll talk about a startup which is started by a 39-year-old. So there you
go. This is great. Empowering the mature age.
basically prehistoric age at this point.
Any listeners that we did have now all left. Okay, so it's interesting. So then his son, Charles Emile Hermes, they moved the store basically sort of towards the center of Paris, sorry. And so that's the store that's still there right now. And that's pretty significant because that was still pre cool. the 1900s, so 1880. And it became their first retail store, again, just selling bridles and harnesses and saddles and stuff like that for horses and stuff. But again, very much just to the elite, starting to catering towards Europe, Russia, North America, Asia, and the Americas, etc. Now, the first that we saw of what could be a handbag was what was actually a bag for the saddles and the harness to carry it around, if that makes sense. So, for example, you might bring your own saddles and harness, but you might be riding someone else's horse, or you might have multiple horses. And so instead of having to carry the pieces, as you would have had to up until this point, they decided they already had their ability to create beautiful leather objects. They decided to make what would kind of look like to us a very large handbag for, I guess in that era, probably men, to put all of their saddleware and stuff like that in, which is kind of interesting. And so that was in the 1880s, which is kind of interesting. And so Charles Emile is very much known for moving the store and creating what's kind of the first instance of a handbag. His son, who's Emile, takes part of his dad's name. Him and his brother, they take over the company, and that's in the very start of the 1900s, so 1902. So about 100 years since Thierry was born. I think he was born in 01, I think I said, of 1800s. And so they changed the name because they're brothers. They're taking it over. They changed the name from Hermès to Hermès Brothers. And so it's Hermès Frères. I think it was how you would say it in French back then. Okay. And
Great
so
rhyme.
Hermès Frères, yeah. And so, okay, interesting thing. So Emile, right, who is the grandson of the original founder of the company at this point, he goes over to Canada, visits Canada. And I thought this was a bit far-fetched, but I looked a little bit on the website as well as secondary sources, and it was all pretty verified. So Emile goes over to Canada and he sees a zipper for the first time, right, in about 1910. Okay, so he's been running the company for about 9-10 years. And he sees a zipper on the front of a military vehicle, or might have been on the back of it or somewhere, to used to kind of like, the canvas material on a lot of the military vehicles, used to kind of close it all in for the weather in Canada because it's notoriously cold. And notice that would be like a great fastener for their handbags to keep everything from falling out. Or at that point, it would have been their saddlebags. And so he introduced the painted into France. So Hermès is known for first patenting the zipper in France, and designed the first bags and clothing with zippers in that time. And it actually became known as the Hermès zipper, which is kind of interesting. And so another interesting notable point was, or I guess turning point for them, was the ascent of motor vehicles, right? So then in the early 1900s, people are starting to use horses less and less, right? And their whole business is predicated on these rich, important people wanting to use horses and then needing their saddles. And that was no longer becoming the case. So in 1922, the first ever actual handbag was produced. And it was just essentially a smaller version of that original saddlebag. And allegedly, Emile, who's the grandson of Thierry, his wife was requesting some sort of bag for her to put her implements in. And so that was the origination, 1922, of the very first handbag by Hermès. And it was just, as I said, a smaller version of that original saddlebag for all the saddle accessories that were required back in the day. So then 3 years later, they made their first ever ready-to-wear product, which was a golf jacket and a golf bag. And again, this was all made out of leather. That was sort of all they knew at that point. And so that was kind of interesting. Other than handbags, Hermès is known for silk scarves, which in my head is very random. But I think the connection is because they don't necessarily do everything. They're very much known for their handbags, and there's a couple of specific handbags that I'll mention in a minute, and you might have even heard of them. They're that kind of famous. And I think the combination of the two, I think silk and leather are like both probably in that day, as far as like fashion, probably the two best materials you could possibly use, is my assumption. And so silk scarves and then leather handbags, I think they're probably the two most popular products they could possibly come up with. And so in 1937, somewhat 12 years later, they came out with the silk scarf. And so that was where you will have seen back in the day a lot of the ladies with like it tied around their head and like a bow kind of underneath like this. So that was the silk scarves. A lot of them were Hermès. So kind of interesting. Now, around the same time, they made what's one of two of their very first very, very, very popular handbags. And so this one is called the Kelly bag. And I'll talk a bit about it in the 50s in a second here, because when it first came out, it really didn't have a lot of notoriety. And so it wasn't until a particular photo was taken was this bag actually, I guess, part of what is now basically pop culture. So the only other product that's worth noting is a tie. And so they in about 1950, they came out with a tie The story goes that one of their workshops was, or one of their retail workshops was located near a casino, and they were constantly getting men who would come in and ask if they had any tie options to try and get into the casino. And so they just recognized the market there, and they started making ties, and as they still do to this day. Emil, who was the grandson, he had a number of children. They were all girls. And so the next person to take on the brand was a guy named Robert Dumas. And so he is the son-in-law of Emil, which is interesting. So he's the first I guess, blood family member to take over the company. And so a little bit of pressure on him. And so interestingly enough, the Kelly bag comes into play here. So in 1956, there was a picture in a magazine called Life magazine, and it's of Princess Grace Kelly of Monaco, right? And she's holding this Hermès bag, the one that they made in the 30s, and she's holding it in front of a pregnant belly. And so people saw the photo in the magazine. It went viral, went all around the world, and so they named it the Kelly bag. And so they literally, I don't know what they originally called the bag back in the day, because they designed it 20 years earlier, but they totally renamed the actual bag itself to the Kelly bag, and it totally transformed the perception of the brand from, at this point, being just the elite to now people who could possibly maybe get their hands on a product themselves.
That's a pretty cool piece of cultural history there then, like a brand being tied in with something a bit historical.
Correct, exactly right. And so there was an issue in about the 60s or 70s where there was a push for synthetic materials. So this is probably the technology had boomed in this area. And so a lot of brands were noticing the efficiencies found and probably some of the benefits in wearing some of these synthetic cottons and stuff like that. But harking back to the original thesis of the company, the runner at the time, the person who was running the company at the time, which is Robert Dumas, he was set on continuing to use the natural materials. And so they actually saw, again, as with the time with the automobiles, they saw like a pretty significant reduction in sales. But they sort of stuck at their intentions. And this is interesting because what it meant was that their products were still expensive where other brands were able to reduce prices using synthetic materials. And so you'd expect their operating profit or their net profit at the end would be significantly reduced because of that, because they're trying to compete with products who are able to use all these other materials. And so it's interesting because that'll come full circle when we talk about their financial performance these days. So the final one is the Birkin bag. So in 1984, again, there's a little story. So again, I found it on the website as well, and so a few sources state it, so I think it's real. Basically, there's an actress named Jane Birkin back in the day, right? And she was known as an actress and also a singer. And she would notoriously carry a wicker basket around. I think the reason being that she could never really find a handbag that was big enough to accommodate everything she wanted to carry. I mean, you see some of the handbags these days are absolutely huge. And so you can see a need for it. And so the story goes that Jean Dumas at this point, who's Robert Dumas's son, he's running the company at this point, and he's on a flight from Paris to London. And she gets on the flight and she takes her basket and she tries to put it in the overhead locker. And the lid comes off and all the stuff falls out. And he gets up and let's just assume that maybe he helps to put all the stuff back in. And then he introduces himself as the manager or the director of Hermès. And they sit down for the rest of the flight and they design what would be the ideal bag for her. And so out of that, initially the bag wasn't that popular. But quickly enough, it became another symbol of sort of like exclusivity. Once enough celebrities started to use it, it had a high price. It had a high. The waiting list was extensive. There's kind of like there's a funny scene, and I think it's Sex and the City. You know, the TV show.
Yeah.
It's a TV show or movie. Maybe it's both.
With Sarah Jessica
there's like
Parker.
A scene. Yes, there's a scene in that where like they go to buy one of the characters. I don't know about the TV show, but one of the characters goes into the store to buy the handbag, and the lady goes, "Oh, you know they're extremely expensive." And the lady goes, "Yes, of course, that's what I want." And then she goes, "You know, there's a massive waiting list." And she says, "Yes, I wouldn't have it any other way." And so it's like implied, like they almost want that because it's like that. It denotes exclusivity, you know. And so they purposely distribute the bags on irregular schedules and kind of like artificially create scarcity around the bags because they could just produce some mass, scale, but they don't want to do that. And so there's 3 particular bags that are like the rarest in the world. Do you have any idea how much they would be? Like when you think of like a handbag, what do you think like an expensive handbag would be nowadays? You've got a great job, but these are real people buying them nowadays. Like I'm not talking about people who are just celebrities now. Real people buy these handbags. They just save up and they buy them. How much do you think like some of these handbags might go for?
I mean, I would say in some of these luxury brands, I would say like, I don't know, $4,500 or something. And I would say like the top end of the absolute extreme might be like 45 or something.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I looked at the top 3 variants of this particular Birkin bag. So they obviously make it in different materials, different colors, stuff like that, right? And so some of them are more rare than others. And so the most rare in existence is the Diamond Sac Birkin. And there's only 3 in existence. I don't know who owns them, but maybe probably someone pretty rich. And they're crafted in rose gold and they're inlaid with more than 2,500 diamonds, right? And it's actually miniaturized, and you wear it like as a bracelet.
Okay.
And the recommended retail on all 3 of them was more than $2 million USD for that particular product. The most expensive actual Birkin bag was a Himalaya bag. And it was constructed out of, I think it's constructed out of crocodile skin. And they painted it white or they dyed it white and grey to kind of look like the Himalayan mountains. So this is an actual product at this point. The recommended retail on that one was $300,000 USD. And there was a secondary sale in 2022 last year at Sotheby's auction house. And it went for, I think it was 440,000 USD. So that was an increase. It's pretty interesting.
It's only going up.
Yeah, which is interesting. And then another one is the Diamond Birkin, which is, again, a crocodile skin with a bunch of diamonds encrusted into the white gold hardware. And so that one recommended retail was up to 250,000 USD. So you can pay massive dollars for these handbags. I think, just to put it back in perspective, I think you were sort of about right. Like, I think recommended retail on an average one, you're talking more like $10,000 to $12,000.
Still pretty crazy though.
But yeah, it's a lot of money for something that you could easily get stolen, or you could easily leave somewhere, or whatever it is.
Exactly, yeah.
So competitors, there's really not that many. There's only 5, which is, I think, interesting. So Chanel is the only company that's private. It's one of these large conglomerates. And so you can't buy it. They're known for things like the little black dress and Chanel No. 5 perfume.
No. 5, yeah. That's what I was guessing.
And yeah, so they're kind of pretty well known. The first company that is public that you could purchase is called Kering, which is actually a 2004 merger between Gucci and a company called PPR. Which now brings Gucci, Saint Laurent, Balenciaga, all under the one conglomerate. The company PPR, that stands for the initials of a pretty wealthy family in Europe, and so they are the largest shareholder in Kering, although it is publicly listed if you would like to purchase some shares. LVMH, as you mentioned, was a merger between Louis Vuitton and Moët Hennessy in 1987. Market cap, I think it's $300 billion USD when I was looking at it earlier. A lot of brands in this one. So Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, Fendi, Sephora, which is a big one. I think I see that a lot these days in shopping centers and stuff. Moët Chandon and Hennessy itself.
Yeah. What I was going to say is Bernard Arnault, the guy there. So he keeps coming up the lists on the billionaires as the richest person in the world,
really?
And dropping back. So he'll often overtake Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk when Amazon and Tesla are having a bad week, because shares, obviously, they stay a lot more fixed. They're more retail sales, less tech speculative. And so he'll often kind of stay in the same place at, 250 billion or whatever it is. Like, he'll have some personal net worth, which is like most of the value of LVMH. And then Elon and Jeff, and a few other people sometimes kind of overtake him. And then, but in the last year, I think he has been technically the richest person
at one
in the
point.
world on paper. Yeah. So I think he's been a few times.
Okay, that's interesting. I suppose it says something for investment in that company then, as some sort of hedge potentially on your more speculative tech stocks potentially. Don't know. Another one, so there's two others. One of them is Richmond, and it has two brands. It's quite new. It was founded in 1988, which is pretty crazy when we're talking about these other brands from the 1800s. But the brands are Cartier and Mont Blanc, and so I've definitely heard of Cartier. And again, largest shareholder is the Rupert family, which are the original founders. But it is public. You can purchase that one on the stock exchange. And L'Oreal. It was founded in 1909, and the only really notable brand I could find within their portfolio, although there are a few, is Giorgio Armani. And so that's a public company. Again, the family owns majority shareholder in that company. So the thing that's interesting about Hermès, and the reason that I wanted to talk about them, is their current net profit margin and an interesting collaboration they've done with a guy named Manny.
Okay.
So in regards to financial performance, and people might be most interested in this, so talking about 2021, because that's where I could find all information for every company. It's interesting to see that the largest, as you say, is LVMH, by far, almost double their competitor, so their nearest competitor. So LVMH is somewhere in the $65 billion revenue range annually, and L'Oreal, which is actually the next largest, is 38, and so a significant increase there. Kering, which was the company that owned quite a number of well-known, your Gucci, your Balenciaga, Saint Laurent, for example, right? They 20 billion, so somewhere around half of L'Oreal in annual revenue, and then Hermès all the way down at just over 11 billion. So kind of smaller in regards to annual revenue, but the interesting thing is the net profit margin. So LVMH 20%, L'Oreal 14%, Kering 16%, Richemont 10%. Now Chanel 36%, but A, private company financials might not be totally correct. B, private company, you can't invest in it anyway, right?
Yeah.
But Hermès, not necessarily private company, 30% net profit margin. So this is net profit margin here. This is not like operating profit, gross profit. Net profit margin. Pretty impressive. So they took home 3 billion from that 11, which is pretty cool, thereabouts. And so, I think very interesting company in regards to profitability. And that's kind of interesting thinking back to the original time where they were really quite unprofitable because they were sticking to their guns and using natural materials where everything else was going synthetic. Whereas you'd say maybe now people are probably swinging back the other way and wanting natural materials to a certain extent. People don't necessarily love chopping up cows so much nowadays though. So handbags, I think it could be an interesting asset class. For example, in the 80s, you could buy a Kelly bag for 4,000. Now it's worth about 10,000 in the secondary market. Birkin bag, again, bottom of the range sort of thing in the 80s, it was about 2,000 in today's dollars. Today, that same bag somewhere around 10,000. And so there's certainly general increase to be made there. There's probably, I was having a look online, right? I was like, okay, surely someone has done the thing where you all, go in together, you pull your money and you buy a handbag.
And fractionalize
fractionalize handbag ownership. But I can't find anything anywhere. So that's potential industry ripe for disruption. You could, combine a little bit of Web3 technology there, maybe some sort of DAO, and go out and buy yourself a Birkin bag. Although the only issue is Birkin bags are very hard to actually purchase because buying them from the store, they won't necessarily just sell them to you. They'll tell you there's a waiting list, and if they don't like you, they'll tell you that there's a locked waiting list, and you may not ever be able to purchase one, which is a very interesting concept. So secondary
very
market
similar to Rolexes as well.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So the only other thing that I think makes this company quite interesting is a collaboration that they did. So they have a department which basically, for particular customers, will do anything. So you come to them with a project that relates to what they do, so relates to use of leather product for the most part, and they will most likely be able to do it for a price. And so a guy named Manny Koshbin, who lives in California, in LA. So I think he is in LA. He lives in Orange County, which is about 2 hours south of LA, and he's a property developer, fully self-made, and he did 3 collaborations with Hermès, and I think we should probably put the photos up. First one is a Bugatti Chiron, fully redid the whole interior. Second one is a McLaren Speedtail.
Oh, I've seen this. That's pretty. Yeah.
And the third one is a Pagani Hyra. And so, yeah, real estate investor guy, he approached them and got 3 collaborations with 3 different cars.
Yeah, I've seen this guy on YouTube. He's pretty funny. He shows off his collection and everything on his YouTube channel.
Yeah,
and
I think it is funny. So I never knew what he did, and then I tried to look him up a bit, and I found he had a bio on one of his websites somewhere, and so it listed him being a property developer XYZ. And a few sources noted his net worth at about 80 million. And I thought, well, I mean, 80 million is a lot of money, but 80 million is not that much money when you see how many cars he has.
Yeah.
Like he has probably $20 million worth of cars, maybe even more. And so I think the intention behind them is that they're actually appreciating assets. If you look at the types of cars he purchases, they're quite unique. And so I think that's his approach, because if they weren't, that would be a little bit scary, like if they were really quite depreciating assets. But I think the idea is that he invests 20%, which is such a large portion of his net worth, right? A quarter of his net worth is invested into what is basically vehicle investment, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes online as well, there's some pretty inaccurate net worth estimates as well.
That's also very true. He might be worth significantly more. So yeah, Hermès, interesting company. As I said, you can buy them on the Paris Exchange. Great net profit margin. Some really interesting custom projects, and a really interesting story, and some interesting products. Would I ever buy one of their products? I think the answer is no. I think it's a slippery slope in my head. I think once you buy a product like that, I think you continue to feel the need to buy products like that. And so I don't think I would want to. I kind of like the idea of just buying simple things. But a lot of people love it, and so they don't need my business. And so, yeah, good company.
Yeah, absolutely.